and welcome everybody to this Clean Air Workplaces for Healthier Employees panel discussion. I am Larissa Lockwood, Director of Clean Air at Global Action Plan, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's session. And I'm delighted to welcome our panel. We've got Mark Grayston, the Head of Product Marketing for Mitsubishi Electric. Maybe you just want to give a wave when I say your name. Alexander Provins, Director EMEA at Blueair, a Unilever company. William Burrows, Area Manager at Zehnder Clean Air Solutions. Graham Petersen, founder of Greener Jobs Alliance, and Andy Haigh, the Senior Sustainability Manager at Canary Wharf Group. So welcome all, and thank you very much for joining us at Clean Air Day Live. I'd like to imagine that we're all sitting on sofas at this point in the day to have a relaxed but informed discussion about workplace air quality, but COVID isn't going to let us do that. And in this COVID era, the workplace is also changing, and we're all becoming much more conscious of the air that we're breathing. And it's good to think about the air we're breathing indoors, not just because of infection control, but because we spend 90% of our time indoors, and because we know that air pollution outside gets inside our buildings, and there it can more easily build up than outside where air pollution dissipates. And indoors, we also use a variety of products and materials that contribute additional pollutants to the indoor air, with the potential to create quite a toxic mix. So as employees, we need to ask questions, and as employers, we need to take responsibility and improve the air that staff are breathing. Because not only is it bad for people's health, as you well know, air pollution causes heart and lung diseases, but it's also bad for business. For if people are ill, they're going to be off work or working below their potential, which ultimately affects the bottom line. And the CBI put some figures on this recently and calculated that if the UK met World Health Organization standards for air pollution, we could gain 3 million working days a year, and that would benefit the UK economy to the tune of 1.6 billion each year. So that is the size of the prize. And with that, let's start the discussion by understanding the problem in more detail before we go into some solutions. So William, let's start with you. Tell us what the issue is in the manufacturing sector that Zehnder Clean Air Solutions are trying to address. What are the causes of poor air quality and the impacts in the industrial workplace?
Thank you, Larissa. That's a good question. So, I mean, from our perspective at Zehnder, I mean, we work with a diverse range of businesses in the manufacturing and the logistics industry. I mean, looking at it, all of these businesses differ in processes, but they all have one commonality. And what that is at a certain point in the process, they produce dust and fumes, okay? Now, these dust and fumes can become excessive and impact health, as we all know. Now, what they tend to do is they lead, I mean, if we look at the exposure, the repeated exposure, the number of hours people are working, the number of days, and the number of years they're in that environment, that leads to a range of health implications that, I mean, it ranges from a spectrum. So if we take the bottom end of that spectrum, and I'll give you a term called black nose syndrome, right? I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's just a coating of dust that's inside the nose. And at the end of the day, if you sneeze or use a tissue, you can see the evidence that's right in front of your face. So following on from that, I mean, that's the bottom end of the spectrum. Following on from that, you have some of the more serious health implications, which would be workplace asthma, COPD, silicosis, and obviously the big one, which would be lung cancer. Now, in these businesses, everybody is aware of the health risks, right? But what we tend to find is the business don't recognize the impact the poor air quality actually has on the business itself. So, I mean, we can all look at the human cost and tick that box and know what the health reasons are, but there's an economic cost to that business. And these companies actually tell us. So when we go and see them, they actually tell us what's going on. And whether that be, I mean, sickness, absenteeism, whether it be the difficulty in actually retaining staff, just because of the working environment. And even if their wells and their exposure levels are all within the limits, staff will still say it's sometimes a poor place to work. So, I mean, as a cost to the business and the health side, you can see both ends of the spectrum. but both of them will have an impact going forward as a country and how we are in business.
Fascinating. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And another work environment that many of us are familiar with is the office environment, which might not strike us immediately as being particularly polluted, especially in comparison to some of those factories and industrial settings you're talking about, William. But Mark, tell us what the air pollution issue is in the office. What is the problem that Mitsubishi Electric are concerned about?
So in the office, it's about choice. So a normal adult human being breathes around 7 to 8 litres of air every minute. And compared to everything else that we sort of consume by volume, air is considerably higher than, for example, food and air. And we tend to have a choice about what we put in our mouths with food and drink. And admittedly, we don't absorb all of the air that we breathe in, but the figures are still worth thinking about. So when it comes to breathing in air in an office space, the awareness and choice tends to be less prominent, where in an office, the sort of one of the main considerations is about lots of people being together for a prolonged period of time, attempting to be as productive as possible whilst being in that space. And air quality can often be 2 to 5 times worse than it is outside. And the pollutants sort of within have a detrimental effect on productivity, health and well-being in those spaces. And in a sort of office environment, the kind of the main detrimental causes of poor air quality are sort of particulate matter, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, ozone and carbon dioxide. So particulate matter, very small particles that become suspended in the air, such as things generated from combustion or from brakes on cars. VOCs from different products being used in offices, such as paint, cleaning supplies, office furniture, photocopiers. Ozone, again, is created as part of commercial photocopiers. And as well, CO2, another key pollutant within these spaces, is generated by ourselves. And we naturally use this. And you know, that potted plant that we tend to have on the windowsill might not be quite cutting it in terms of cutting that down. And to sort of, I suppose, just summarize that is the kind of effects from an office worker point of view is nicely summarized by a study that Harvard did. And they took knowledge workers, managers, architects, and designers, and they spent 6 days working 9 till 5 where the air quality was controlled. And the participants were blind to the conditions. And at the end of each day, the workers' decision-making performance was tested using a standard cognitive function test. And it was found that breathing better air led to significantly better decision-making performance. And they saw higher test scores across 9 cognitive function domains when they're exposed to increased ventilation rates, lower level of chemicals, and lower CO2. With the biggest improvements on workers being around when they're making strategic decisions and how they plan, stay prepared, and strategize during crisis situations. So in an office environment, indoor air quality really does have a huge impact on the effect of the people within.
Fascinating. And yeah, if people knew more about that, I think they'd be paying a lot more attention. So thank you for sharing that, Mark. Now, those of us who were familiar with the office environment are finding we're spending quite a bit more time in a different and unusual work environment, that of the home office, and yeah, not the government department. And while we will no doubt go back to the office at some point in the future, it does seem that the trend is towards increased home working, at least for part of the week. So at the height of lockdown, about 40% of the UK population was at least attempting to work from home. And of that 40%, the vast majority would like to keep doing so to some extent. So Alexander, tell us what we need to think about with regards to air pollution in our home offices. Is it a problem, and where is the pollution coming from?
Yes, hello and thank you. So, I mean, the indoor air at home is made up of concentration of particles from the outdoor air, like, for example, exhaust fumes, road particles, pollen, to mention a few. And these comes in through ventilation and windows, and they get mixed with pollutants from within the home and also get trapped within the home. So you have others like dust, mold, smoke from, example, wood burning or candlelights, bacteria, viruses, pet danger. And breathing in this fine dust of particles like the PM, the smallest one like the PM1 and the PM 2.5 can penetrate deep into lungs. And you, of course, have talked about this a lot throughout the day. But it causes a lot of, direct and indirect types of conditions. And it's the same with the home and work environment and the air quality at home. And of course, you also, like the study at Harvard just mentioned, you feel unfocused and you get tired when you don't have good air quality, and you get less productive. But also, bad air quality also increases the likeliness of catching diseases that is spread airborne, like a seasonal flu, but also like the COVID-19 is recognized to be spread by the air. For example, in the US, the CDC, they also recommend some weeks ago air purifier as a protective measure to take at home and indoors. And we can come back to that a little bit later if you want, on how that can be effective at home.
Yes, I would like to come back to that later on, because we've had some COVID related questions as well, because I know it's quite a hot topic at the moment. So thank you, Alexander. And the home is, I'd expect, quite an unregulated work environment. But Graham, as founder of the Greener Jobs Alliance, you know a lot more about this than I do. So what's your perspective on the situation regarding indoor air pollution regulations in all these settings? In the home, in the office, and in the industrial workplace? What are the trade unions concerned about right now in terms of conditions and standards when it comes to air quality?
Thanks, Larissa. And yeah, if you can hear me okay, thanks for the invitation to this panel, and interesting to hear the views of the other panelists, because it certainly underlines what the Greener Jobs Alliance has been saying for some time now, and that is that this is an occupational health issue. The reason why we set up with the Hazards Campaign an organisation called the Trade Union Clean Air Network was because we felt that if you looked at government policy and even local authority policies, there was actually a complete lack of recognition of this issue. And given that you know, most air pollution is related in some way to work activities, it just seemed a huge gap in terms of the policy framework on this. So one of the main things that we've been looking at is what the current state of play is as far as regulations, legislation, as it affects the workplace, applies to this hazard. And our view is that certainly improvements need to be made both in the content of the law at work, but also the enforcement side as well, because it's no good simply just having decent laws protecting workers from air pollution risks if they're not enforced at the workplace. And I suppose the final point I'd make on that in this contribution is that we'd hope also that companies would recognise that there is a resource inside the workplace to help deal with that, and that is the trade union where it's recognised, because many of these trade unions will have safety representatives, and obviously safety reps will be concerned about the occupational health of their members, and we'd like to think that companies and unions will be able to work together around this issue to try and ensure that effective control measures are put in place.
Super, and great to hear that this is something that the unions are looking at. So tell me, as we move into the more solutions part of the discussion, what is it that the unions are calling for on this?
Well, we're calling for something in the Environment Bill that's been kind of like put on hold for the moment. It's over 200 days since it was first introduced, but when we eventually see it again, we're looking for improved standards around air quality, and ideally even something that also references the workplace, because obviously outdoor workers do have a degree of protection as a result of European directives. But the standards that actually exist still aren't good enough. So we would certainly argue that we would want World Health Organization standards on particulate matter in as a minimum. But we'd also want a review of some of the legislations that affects the workplace, like the control of substances hazardous health regulations, the workplace exposure limits, and workplace regulations, just to actually, they need reviewing, because although they do provide some protection, given that this has now moved forward as such an important issue, we feel that they do need to be looked at again to ensure that that protection does exist. Because, for example, an obvious hazard would be diesel exposure to diesel fumes in the workplace, which is a very prevalent problem. We don't feel that currently the legal standards around that are sufficient. And so, that's an area where we'd certainly want to be campaigning nationally as a union to be trying to make sure that those improvements were put in place.
I'm going to unmute myself. That's really helpful insight. Thank you, Graham. And I'm going to come back to William now, because this is resonating with some of the work that we've been doing with Zehnder Clean Air Solutions. So, William, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts following the work that we've been doing to shine a light on industrial workplace standards. You could tell us a little bit more about some of those findings and what you think needs to change in the industrial sector to address air pollution.
I mean, to answer your question, does it resonate? Absolutely, absolutely. It rings true from what we hear from customers and from their staff in that environment. I mean, hence our white paper. We're doing a white paper with Global Action Plan at the moment, and we're chapping at the door of government with a big stick and to businesses to understand where they're actually at with this at the moment. So, I mean, we launched this at the end of October, and we'll be holding a webinar on the 5th of November on this white paper. And to give you a little sneak peek or insight into that, we all know workplace exposure limits, but we tend to find that some of the businesses lack the knowledge, and this is to pick up on Graham's point, they lack the knowledge to manage their air quality within the limits, or the enforcement is not always adequate. So to give you that example, right, the World Health Organization, they have a limit of no one should be exposed to more than 50 micrograms, an average of 50 micrograms of airborne PM10 particulate over an 8-hour period. Now, the UK standard is 200 times that level, right? Now, that's not been reviewed since 1984. Okay, now we want government to review this on the wells and the particulate level, but we're saying to businesses, don't wait for government. This is a good thing to do just now, and we're actually encouraging them to look at it as an opportunity, not just from a compliance point of view. It doesn't have to be always from a compliance point of view. Businesses, I mean, they're spending money, they're spending time, they're spending money, and they're spending energy and resources on managing dust and fumes in the workplace. I mean, if people breathe it in, if the dust falls on the floor, they have to manage it. If it falls in a machine, they have to fix it. If it falls in a product, they have to remake it. So, I mean, these businesses are looking at the effects rather than the causality. So if we take the airborne dust and contaminants or airborne dust and fumes and remove them before they affect the health, which is always number one, I think, and also it can be economical for that business, then, I mean, it's going to be beneficial in the long term. Now, as we move forward into a post-COVID world, I don't know what that looks like yet, but there's an opportunity here to rebuild businesses efficiently in a more sustainable way. So to answer the question, does it resonate? Yes. I mean, my personal experiences, I've worked in this business for the last 5 years with some of the blue chip companies, and when they understand what poor air quality is, they make positive change when they understand the impacts it's affecting their business. And what you tend to find is they become passionate and they talk about it, just as I am, and that filters from top down. So to answer your question again, does it resonate? Wholeheartedly.
Great, thank you. And I can tell you're very passionate about it. And yeah, I can't believe the standards haven't been updated since 1984. That's food for thought. Yeah. Andy, I'd like to bring you in here. At Canary Wharf Group, you're working across a range of workplaces, residential, offices and retail. So what are your thoughts on the build side of the workplace? How can the design of the buildings and the materials used help to optimize pollution reduction and mitigation?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, a lot of people have talked about the impact of poor air quality and a lot of the causes, but when you're inside, there are a lot of sources of indoor air pollution. From the CO2 that we breathe out, but also from the kind of the paints, the carpets, the soft furnishings, the furniture that you install within a building will all off gas and be causes of pollution. But then also things like the cleaning supplies or the print room, etc. So good design can help mitigate those sources of contaminants and either remove them or reduce them from the occupied zones. So it's about kind of thinking right from the outset about how you can design the floor plate or the areas to remove those sources of contaminants. So examples as the print rooms or garages, or for in car parks, etc. Try to separate out the office areas to the sources of fumes and car exhausts. But it's also about having good design specifications and good design briefs for the material choices. So ensuring for paints, it's low VOC paints. And a lot of these material choices don't have a cost or a color or an aesthetic or a performance variation, because there are now so many low VOC or low impact material choices out there now. But you still have the poor performing options out there, which people fall back on because they don't necessarily know the difference. So it's about spending the time. If you strip it down from Canary Wharf to doing a home renovation, it's just taking the time to turn around and look at the paint tin or the sealant or the adhesive or whatever you're going to use, and look at the VOC quantities. But yeah, so at Canary Wharf, for us, it's about having a healthy materials brief, and then which we go out to all of our trades, making sure that they take that on board. And so from literally the ground up, making sure that we're not using harmful materials, or, and it's not just what you see, it's not the paints, it is the underlays, it's the adhesives that stick your carpet tiles down. So you have to think about it right from the beginning, rather than just when you get your painter and decorator in to do the finishing touches. I would add to that, though, that you then need to spend time airing the building out afterwards. So similar to when you paint your home, you leave the windows open, there is still a portion of that when you're designing 50-story towers like the ones that we have at Canary Wharf as well.
Great, thank you. And interesting that you're asking suppliers to consider the sort of emissions content of their materials. How easy is it to source lower emission products?
Very. There are a very small number of instances, so like intumescent paints, which is a type of paint that when your structural steel is in a fire, the paint expands and provides a protective, supportive barrier to it. So things like that tend to be quite nasty stuff, but they're there for a purpose. But they are usually installed kind of 6, 9, 12 months before you actually get to the fit out. So by that point, they would have off-gassed. But when you start to look at the internal kind of core areas, cost negligible, and it's just a question of kind of working with them and engaging with them to make sure you're making the right choices. It might mean you have to use a different plasterboard supplier, so you can get a different mastic or sealant to go with it. But there's not a cost impact, it's just a upfront engagement impact. But there are so many solutions out there now, a lot more so than 5, 6, 7 years ago, when this wasn't as big an issue at design stage.
Excellent. So it's just about asking the right questions at that design stage. Super. Mark, I'd be interested on your thoughts on this in an office workplace context. Obviously, choosing the right materials at build stage is important, but what do businesses then need to do in terms of sort of managing that office environment? What do you think businesses need to do to address air pollution in the office?
Yeah, so I mean, quite simply, ventilate it and understand the benefits of sort of doing so. If you look at the building regulations, they tend to be pushing an increase in energy efficiency, which result in new buildings to be very airtight. and stop that sort of heated, cooled air from leaking from the building and wasting energy. And this needs to happen, of course, to reduce the amount of carbon our buildings generate. But the byproduct of that being is we're keeping all of those indoor pollutants trapped in the building itself. And then you've kind of got the flip side to the building regulations that are more focused on the new build, that are looking at older building, when we're looking at older buildings. And that's a huge percentage of the building stock for offices in the UK. And quite often the sort of the ventilation strategies that are used within these properties will not probably be effective compared to what they were designed for originally. So one strategy that's sort of been required to change over the past 6 months is to kind of open up windows where available. And that's been kind of great when it's been warm outside, but what about now when it's getting a bit colder? And another example is, you know, I often see an old office with no air conditioning that gets overheated in the summer, and then it gets the air conditioning installed and all the windows that they used to open now close. Other things sort of happen in offices, you know, you see a rise in density in office in density of people, but obviously not at the moment, but previous to where we are now, that was happening. Photocopiers being installed next to people, cleaning schedules changes, that's obviously relevant now. Adding in partitions, changing layouts. So facilities managers need to stay alert of these changes and make their buildings to ensure that they can meet the ventilation demand. And furthermore as well, we're kind of living in this point of growing urbanisation. So when we're looking at all of these different things and we're kind of thinking about designing the buildings today, they could be quite different in quite a short period of time. And a new building as well, you know, a new building going up next to another one could potentially block the air pressures around it, therefore not being able to naturally ventilate the building as it was first designed. So I suppose moving on to the kind of solutions, generally there's kind of two ways that you can ventilate, naturally or mechanically. So naturally you're using no energy to move the air, but you're relying on air currents and differences in pressure from inside and outside. It's quite hard to control, but if designed, it proved really effective. Mechanical is using more like a low-powered fan to move the air, extracting and supplying simultaneously, and usually in a steady continuous rate, which can also be boosted. And also on these type of solutions, you can also add in heat recovery, and this reduces the impact of how much energy you waste to outside. You're trapping that. So I suppose as a final sort of summary, I think mechanical ventilation can ensure effective air changes at all times, and considering sort of 3 steps. So sort of step 1 being extract that indoor air, with that sort of inside air being between 2 to 5 times more polluted than outdoors. Logically, extracting it out should be the first port of call. Step 2, introduce some fresh air. Replace that stale air with new air from outside and create a balanced system. Introduce some better filtration for the air as it enters into the building itself, and potentially adding a localized air purification system, which I think Alexander's going to talk about a bit later. And then thirdly, recover the heat. So try and reuse much heat as you put into that building to keep it comfortable as possible out of that outgoing air. So they're kind of the 3 steps, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't prioritize the cleaning up of air pollution and air outside. Absolutely not. The need for clean air does not change whether we're inside or outside.
Absolutely, great. Thank you, Mark. And yes, source reduction first, and then exposure reduction and getting rid of the stuff through all the methods you suggest second. Great. I am going to move on to you in a moment, Alexander, to come back to our home office situation. But just while we're talking about ventilation and so on, we have had a question on the Slido, which I think I'm going to ask now to you, Mark, because it links. With the current situation with COVID-19, if I have air conditioning in my office, should it be turned off if I do not have any ventilation equipment?
Okay, so with regards to air conditioning, I suppose there's been various bits of guidance that have been published. Health and Safety Executive, as an example, recently stated that the risk of spreading coronavirus via air conditioning is extremely low, given that there's an adequate supply of fresh air and ventilation. So the need for fresh air and ventilation in any space, whether it has air conditioning or not, where multiple people are occupying, should be the consideration that you're making. There's lots and lots of guidance around this from the likes of BISA, CIBSE, ASHRAE, Riva, and you know, if you're thinking about the sort of steps that they're looking at, of generally it's understood that the risk of transmission outside is a lot better than inside. So if you can make your inside as good as outside in terms of the ventilation and the fresh air, then that's all the better.
Can I quickly add to that? So,
yes, please do.
From a Canary Wharf perspective, we're encouraging our tenants to ask us what our maintenance and management regimes are for our air quality systems. So we're increasing fresh air rates to near 100%, and we're ensuring that all the filtration is changed regularly and communicating that, because there is, like you say, or like this person has asked, that the perception that air conditioning is just recirculating all the bad stuff, but actually what it's doing is filtering and pushing good quality air into the space. So yes, you need to be aware what's your freehold or your managing agent's doing, and we should be asking those questions of them to make sure they are following the advice that Mark's recommended.
Lovely, thank you. And it's yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? HVAC has sort of been it just goes on in the background and no one's paid any attention to it, but suddenly it's the question that everybody wants to know about. Right, let's move back to the home environment, and well, the home office, where so many of us are working these days. And as the nights draw in and the weather gets colder, fewer of us are opening those windows. So Alexander, coming to you again, for those of us working at home with little opportunity to do things like change the build, what are your top tips to help home workers improve indoor air pollution, to help protect our health and productivity in this environment too?
Yeah, first I would like to frame that a little bit, because I think people's home are mostly where we don't have so much data as company or studies is mostly carried out on public spaces and offices and these kind of things. So, and we talked about this, it's normally 5 times more polluted. And how bad can it be at home? So I think this can differ, and I will draw a little bit of a parallel to what we do know. After having donated hundreds of air purifiers to schools in need in the UK as a part of our Clean Up for Children program, Blueair have measured air quality in several classrooms before and after installation of air purifiers. And we found out that some of these schools had up to 40 times more polluted air in the classroom than on the street outside. And of course, this is really terrible. Not all the classrooms were this bad, but in general, it was really surprisingly bad. And this condition is often related to the building standard and especially poor ventilation, as we heard former speaker talk about as well. And I therefore, I mean, this you can also link into people's apartment and also houses. With substandard ventilation, like for example, old Victorian building, you need to make sure to look into your ventilation system as a first step. And I will come back a little bit on that. But what we did in the schools, after installing the purifiers, we reduced 98% of the pollutants in just 1 hour in the classroom, and also keeping the pollutant level at very low levels and safe levels. So I think that investing in an air purifier is definitely a good investment to improve the indoor air quality at home or in other places, preferred destinations. And I mentioned the ventilation earlier, and I think that is the foundation to good air quality also at home. It's super important. And if you don't have a good ventilation system, and sometimes you maybe rent and the landlord don't want to do anything, or you have a house so you don't want to rebuild the whole house, I think to open the windows and do short natural ventilation breaks throughout the day if you're working at home, that is a good thing. And you don't need to have it open for half an hour now when winter comes. You can open it a couple of minutes, a couple of days, a couple of times during the day, and that will do a good job. Of course, you should not open it in rush hour if you live next to a busy road, but I think that says itself, right? And then, of course, you should clean your home regularly, vacuum frequent, wet wipe floors, surfaces, regularly wash beddings and other textiles, super important also to keep pollutants away. You can also avoid unnecessary chemicals and the use of and use also natural cleaning products when that is suitable. So in order to give yourself the best condition when working from home, you should follow the recommendation, and I think also, you know, invest and put out the air purifier in the room there where you spend the most of your time. So, you know, you don't need to buy for the whole house if you have a big house. You can buy for a couple of rooms where you actually spend most of the time. So that's a good starting point. Also want to make a short recommendation when looking into buying an air purification system. You should look out for a high performing system. There are several good ones on the market, but also a lot of brands that overpromise and underdeliver. So important to look for the CADR value on the unit. And I think CADR is a global leading third-party standard on performance for air purifiers, and it takes in consideration how much clean airflow a unit can give you in a given time. And I think that basically that's the thing that's important for you.
Lovely, great, thank you so much. So we've had a range of questions come in while you've all been talking. So I think I'm going to group them together, and then you can choose which one you want to address when I come to you. So there's a few here. So firstly, what do the panel think about the influence of outdoor air pollution when cleaning indoor air pollution, for example, more mechanical ventilation? Are we just moving the problem? So you may choose to pick that one. There's a very specific one for Mark, but anyone else could answer it. Would a purifier work? And another one I'll take, I work for a law firm in the corporate responsibility team. Are there any resources or advice I can use? And I will save my plug till last. So I think we will start, I'm going to do this in the order of William, Mark, Graham, Andy, Alexander. So William, to you first.
So yeah, I mean, to answer the question, yeah, air purifiers would work, but I mean, indoor environments, ideally you're looking, our background is based on manufacturing and the logistics sector. So primarily we are tending to find that indoor air pollution as opposed to outdoor. There's specific, which Mark would probably touch on a bit better in terms of my knowledge in that spectrum. But yeah, air purifiers would work. I mean, if you take the subway or anywhere outside that they're looking at, and you had air purifiers in these environments, yeah, you can certainly make a difference. It just means that there's not a one size fits all solution, I suppose, but there's guidelines that you probably have to look at in order to actually get the right balance of what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Thank you. Graham, coming to you. Do you want to pick one of them? If there's any advice or resources available on purifiers, or the question about moving the problem?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, because of course it isn't one or the other, is it? That you know, when we're talking about outdoor pollution, that can have an impact indoors and vice versa as well. So I think, you know, it brings us back to the issue of monitoring and how important that is. A problem for me, I think, is that this monitoring isn't taking place at the scale that we need it to in order to get a full understanding of the problem, because, you know, you can apply a risk assessment process to this, but unless you're aware of the exact nature of the hazard, then it's going to be a bit limited in terms of your response. That brings me on, I mean, one point that I think, you know, certainly Toucan have been arguing for some time now is that, you know, if you're looking at capacity on monitoring, then you could argue that you could look at some job creation around this as well. And we've been calling for air quality apprenticeships for some time. And I think it might start to get some traction. There's a lot more work needs to be done about what you put in place for that. But if you had certainly local authority level, as well as large companies employing someone with that kind of specialism that could make themselves available to workplaces to do the kind of measurements and monitoring that we're talking about, that would be, you know, a massive improvement, and also a job creation issue as well. On the subject of monitoring, I could add that Toucan have purchased an air monitor in conjunction with Global Action Plan, and we're at a very small level starting to look at how we can support safety reps in workplaces to actually do their own monitoring as part of a, if you like, worker or citizen science activity, to then be able to present the results to the employer in the absence of the kind of thing that we'd like to see at full scale capacity.
Great, thank you, Graham. And clean air apprenticeships, what a great idea, and something to build into the promised green recovery. Mark, coming to you, which question would you like to pick up?
Yeah, sure. So I'll touch on a little bit on both, but I suppose from our point of view, there's probably a hierarchy of air purification, ventilation, obviously getting it right outside first. So air purifier work, yes, it does work. It's not going to reduce the CO2 levels, which are an important thing, obviously, internally in the space, and that's what you get from the ventilation. But I'm sure Alexander might have more detail on that. But I suppose the influence of outdoor air and indoor air, I can talk a bit more about. But typically, outdoor air, if you are considered, there's many options to add filtration onto your incoming air systems. Whether that be some sort of a simple filtration that's just taking out particulates, small, relatively large particulates, through to kind of HEPA filtration that takes out lots and lots of different things, active filtration, carbon filtration that takes out NOx. But again, picking up on one of Graham's point there, the monitoring. So you can get active monitoring systems that kind of monitor indoor and outdoor air and choose, depending on which one's the best, as to how to modulate the systems between the two. Looking at elements such as CO2, such as particulate matter, etc. So there are options that can be included on systems.
Lovely, thank you very much. Then I've forgotten what order I said I do this in. Andy, I think we'll come to you.
Perfect, because I want to once again add to what Mark was saying. I think filtration is key. I think going back to design of a building can really help as well in terms of where the air intakes are. So if it's next to the polluted road, then your filter's going to have to work a lot harder than if your air intakes for building at the top of the building. But then once again, going back to kind of challenging your building managers, it's not just having a filter in there that's got bunged up and hasn't been touched for 6 months. It's about making sure they're going and checking and replacing it regularly. It's both how coarse or how fine the filter is, but then it's also about how often it's replaced. So you could have a HEPA filter that filled up 3 years ago and then has just become useless and making your systems work harder, or you could have a really good management system in place to make sure it's running efficiently. And then the measuring and monitoring thing, I completely agree. At the moment, it's either far too expensive, or you can buy £100 monitor online and on Amazon to get it delivered next day, which is basically just like a children's toy. So there needs to be a better balance and more regulation in terms of what you should be using to prove good indoor air quality. And I use both of those. I use the £5,000 and I use the £50 versions in the office. But yes, I think that is the next step in getting more measurement and monitoring out there for the masses and transparency around it.
Thank you. And then Alexander, I will give the last word to you. So pick a question and round us off.
Yeah, and I think I can answer a little bit on the air purifier. It do work. I mean, we have a lot of data to provide that. It do work very effectively in the indoor air. I mean, an air purifier outdoor, that is also something that is tried out in different locations in Europe and also Asia, where I've seen, but it's highly inefficient outdoors. It's more of a gimmick then, because it can not really. So you need outdoor. You need to go to the source and come to right with that. But indoor buildings, air purifiers do work fantastically, and also in combination with ventilation system, it's of course key to protect yourself. Also, I can recommend, if you some years ago we developed a pretty cool service called AirView. You can have a look at it, airview.blueair.com. It's a free service there where you can type in your address and you can see, visualize what kind of pollutants is in real time at your doorstep, outdoor of your home or office, or at wherever you want to see.
Thank you, Alexander. We will have a look at that. I'm just conscious the next session is going to start, so I'm going to have to round us up. So the words I've written: standards, monitoring, ventilation, filtration, purification. And why are we doing it? For health benefits, productivity, and job creation. I should say a couple of the things that we mentioned in terms of resources. We do have the Business for Clean Air initiative. It's just Google that, you'll find it, Business for Clean Air. It's a movement, growing movement of leading companies who are pledging and acting to become clean air businesses. So join that. And we are going to be putting out a white paper with Zehnder Clean Air Solutions, looking at industrial air quality in the workplace. So please do follow Global Action Plan on LinkedIn to find out when that is launched and come along to the webinar. So thank you to the panel today, William, Mark, Alexander, Graham and Andy, and thank you all very much for listening.